The morning sun touched the wedding photo on the mantel, but warmth didn't reach her eyes. A soft light spread through Evelyn Hart's seaside cottage, gliding over framed memories, the pale shells her husband once collected, and the single chair that still sat across from hers at the breakfast table. The kettle whistled once, then fell silent, as if even it understood that sound could bruise. Welcome to True Voice. If you're watching this, like and subscribe, and let me know where you're watching from. The words drifted through the quiet like a ritual. She always began her day that way now. One small act of order, one echo of connection. Outside, gulls circled the grey horizon. The tide breathed in and out, the only steady rhythm left since Harold's heart had stopped 6 months ago. The cottage still smelled faintly of cedar and the sea. His scent, woven into every sleeve she couldn't yet pack away. Some mornings she could almost hear him humming off-key while polishing his watch. A Rolex with a soft gold face, the one he had bought after 40 years at the docks. "Time's our truest wage," he'd said. "Spend it wisely." She kept the watch in a velvet box on the nightstand, or so she thought. Evelyn's niece, Lila, had been visiting often lately. "Aunt Eve," she'd said yesterday, "you should let me handle those estate papers. It's time to move forward." There had been sympathy in her tone, but something else too, a brightness that didn't belong to grief. Lila and her husband were always planning another trip, another purchase, another new start. Now, as Evelyn washed the 2 remaining teacups, she felt a quiet wrongness settle over her. The room looked the same, yet thinner somehow, as though one small thread had been pulled from the weave. She dried her hands, walked to the bedroom and opened the drawer. The velvet box was gone. Her breath caught. Perhaps she had moved it. She searched every drawer, every shelf, even under the folded sweaters where she sometimes hid old letters. Nothing. The tick she expected to hear, that soft, faithful heartbeat of gold, was absent. On the desk, the estate binder lay open. A page had been torn from the back. Evelyn sank onto the edge of the bed. The sea's distant rhythm pressed through the windows, indifferent, eternal. In her chest, the pulse of disbelief began to quicken into something colder, steadier. She lifted her gaze to the window where light met mist and whispered, "Harold, someone sold our time." The phone rang. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. A man's voice, gentle, uncertain. "Mrs. Hart. I'm sorry to trouble you. My name's Victor Lane. I own Tide and Time Pawn downtown. I think we have something that belongs to you." Her throat tightened. "I don't understand." "A gold Rolex, engraved on the back. To Harold for every hour we shared. I bought it this morning. The young couple said it was theirs. Inheritance sale. But something about the engraving. I looked you up." Evelyn closed her eyes. The kitchen clock ticked once, sharply. "Who sold it?" Her voice was calm, almost detached, like a tide drawing away before a storm. "They signed as Lila Graham and Peter Graham. Said you gave permission." Silence. Only the gulls now, calling over the grey water. "Would you like me to hold it for you?" Victor asked. "Yes," Evelyn said, each letter deliberate. "Please keep it safe. I'll come by this afternoon." When she ended the call, her hands trembled, but her eyes did not. She looked once more at the mantel. The photo of her and Harold caught the morning sun again, and for the first time, she noticed her own reflection layered over his smile, faint but certain, like the horizon drawing its line between sea and sky. She whispered, almost to herself, "They think they sold gold. They don't know what they've bought." The kettle clicked as it cooled, echoing the tick of a missing watch. Outside, the wind began to rise, carrying with it the salt and the promise of change. By afternoon, the sky had turned the color of pewter. Mist clung to the window panes, and the sea beyond looked like melted metal, heavy and silent. Evelyn wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped out into the chill, the air tasting faintly of rain and salt. Each step toward the small town felt like walking deeper into truth. Tide and Time Pawn stood on the corner of Main Street, its window filled with clocks that never quite agreed on the hour. When she pushed the door open, a bell chimed, thin, polite, uncertain. Behind the counter stood Victor Lane, mid-40s, kind-eyed, with oil-stained fingertips and a steady stillness that came from years of listening more than speaking. He looked up from a tray of rings. "Mrs. Hart." She nodded. He reached beneath the counter and drew out a small velvet pouch. The sound of it sliding across the glass was soft, reverent, like a secret returning home. "I knew it couldn't have been theirs," he said. "They couldn't even tell me what the engraving meant." Evelyn opened the pouch. The gold watch gleamed faintly, catching the weak light. There was a faint scuff along the bezel, a wound like her own. She turned it over. The words still shimmered. "To Harold for every hour we shared." Her fingers brushed the metal, and for an instant she felt the warmth of his pulse beneath it. A memory trick, but real enough to steady her. "Do you want to buy it back?" Victor asked gently. She lifted her eyes. "How much?" He hesitated. "They sold it for 3,000. It's worth 10. I'll sell it to you for what I paid. Nothing more." Evelyn drew in a slow breath. "Thank you. But I won't buy it yet. Not until I know exactly what they've done." Victor studied her face, grief wrapped in discipline, then nodded. "I'll hold it." Take your time. When she stepped back outside, rain had begun to fall. Not hard, just steady enough to blur the edges of the street. She walked toward the cafe across the square, where she could sit by the window and think. The air smelled of wet leaves and roasted coffee. Her mind replayed the past weeks. Lila sorting through Harold's papers, offering to handle the small stuff, insisting Evelyn rest. How easily she'd trusted. Grief makes fools of the faithful. She took a napkin and began to write names, dates, small memories, the way Harold had shown her to keep his business ledgers balanced. Each fact a piece of the betrayal's puzzle. She realized Lila had access to his safe deposit box, the spare keys, even the estate passwords. The waitress approached. Refill, Mrs. Hart. Evelyn looked up, startled back into the world. Yes, please. Thank you. When the waitress walked away, Evelyn stared at the steam rising from her cup. The watch had always marked more than time. It had been Harold's promise, that even when he was gone, she would never be left behind. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. Her fingers trembled as she dialed Lila's number. Hi, Aunt Eve. Lila's voice was bright, wind-blown, laughter behind it. We're in Capri. You wouldn't believe the villa. Evelyn closed her eyes. Capri, course. Lila, she interrupted softly. Did you take Harold's watch? Then. What? Oh, we thought you'd said. Well, Peter said you didn't need it anymore, that maybe we could sell it to help with the... Evelyn's silence stretched so long that even through the static, it became a weight. You sold it, she whispered. Aunt Eve, we didn't mean, we thought you'd. Enjoy your vacation, she said quietly. We'll talk when you're home. Before Lila could answer, she ended the call. Outside, the rain quickened, striking the window like ticking seconds. She sat there a long while, watching her reflection blur in the glass until she could barely tell where her face ended and the gray sky began. Then she smiled, not bitterly, but as someone who had remembered something important. Harold had once told her, a storm only knows it's a storm when it hits the shore. By evening, she was back in the cottage. She opened the estate binder again, found the torn section, and saw the faint impression of Lila's handwriting pressed into the next page. She held it to the light. It read, Box 117, Harbor Bank. Authorization signature. Evelyn Hart. Her own name forged. The storm outside rose higher, wind rattling the windows. She stood, straightened her shoulders, and took one last look at the missing velvet box's empty space. Then she closed the drawer, turned off the lamp, and whispered into the dark. They borrowed time. I'll show them what the debt costs. The sea roared back, as if in agreement. Somewhere inside her, a calm center formed. Not the quiet of surrender, but of direction. Tomorrow she would visit the bank. Tomorrow the tide would turn. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The rain had left a shimmer on every blade of grass, and the sky wore the pale blue of healing. Evelyn dressed deliberately. Soft gray slacks, cream blouse, and the thin gold chain Harold had given her on their 10th anniversary. Her hands no longer trembled. The harbor bank stood on a hill overlooking the marina, its glass walls catching the light like still water. Evelyn entered with her head high, the faint scent of sea air following her. At the reception desk, a young man smiled. Good morning. How may I help you? I'd like to review a safety deposit record, she said, her tone calm, practiced. Box 117. My name is Evelyn Hart. He tapped at his keyboard, frown deepening. It says here the contents were released last week. Authorized by you. Her pulse didn't quicken, it slowed. Could I see that authorization? He hesitated. Of course. Moments later, he returned with a clipboard. The signature was there, bold and careless. Her name misspelled slightly, Evelyn Hart. The handwriting looped where hers was neat. The date matched the same day Lila and Peter had flown to Italy. May I have a copy of this? She asked. He nodded. We'll email it right away. When she stepped back outside, the breeze was sharp with salt. She stood for a moment, letting the truth settle into shape. The Rolex wasn't the only thing they had taken. They had emptied her husband's final savings, the one meant for the scholarship fund he'd planned for young fishermen's children. Betrayal had reached past greed. It had touched purpose. That night, Evelyn sat at her desk long after the lamps burned low. Papers, copies, printouts surrounded her. The hum of the old refrigerator and the tick of the kitchen clock were the only sounds. She drafted emails, collected bank correspondences, and opened a fresh folder on her computer. Restoration. Days turned into a quiet rhythm of motion. She called Harold's old accountant, who still owed her kindness. She spoke with a lawyer in the next town, careful with her words. And always she returned to the pawn shop, not to reclaim the watch but to think. Victor noticed. You're planning something, he said one afternoon as she stood watching the clocks in his display. Not revenge, she replied softly. Correction. He nodded as though he understood the difference. Do you want me to keep the watch here? For now. She traced her finger along the glass above it. When this is over, I'll buy it back properly. The way Harold earned it, with patience. As she left the shop, the late afternoon sun caught her reflection in the window, no longer fragile but defined like the coastline after the tide withdraws. A week later, she drove to the edge of town where a "for sale" sign leaned in front of a row of newly built rental homes. The property belonged to a holding company, one she had quietly invested in years before, when Harold had urged her to make the sea work for you, not against you. Now, she used that same company to purchase the Graham's house, the one Lila had insisted was their dream, financed through her husband's inheritance. When the papers were signed, Evelyn felt no triumph, only stillness. Justice, she thought, shouldn't roar. It should arrive like the tide. Steady, inevitable. She waited until the Grahams returned from Italy. The first call came 2 days later. "Aunt Eve." Lila's voice wavered. "Our landlord just told us the property was sold. Some management group bought it, they're tripling the rent. We can't afford that. Could you maybe?" Evelyn's tone was gentle, almost maternal. "Oh, Lila. I do wish you'd been more careful with what you already had. But Aunt Eve, we thought." "I know," she said quietly. "You thought time was yours to spend." Silence on the other end. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock beside her, matching her heartbeat. "Goodbye, dear," she said softly and ended the call. That evening, she returned to Tide and Time Pawn. The sun was low, turning the windows gold. Victor smiled as she entered. "Ready?" he asked. "Yes." She placed an envelope on the counter, the full amount and then some. "For keeping it safe." He handed her the velvet pouch. "You could have just bought a new one." She shook her head. "You can't replace time, only redeem it." Outside, she stood on the sidewalk as the church bells rang 6 times. The sea beyond shimmered with the same gold that gleamed in her palm. She fastened the watch around her wrist. The weight was familiar, right? As though Harold had reached through the hours to steady her hand. For a moment she looked up at the horizon, the gulls wheeling in the last light, and whispered, "We're even now." The tide answered with a sigh. But deep down, she knew it wasn't quite over. The true reckoning would come not from money, but from truth, and that she would deliver personally. The sea was calm again. Days had passed since Evelyn reclaimed the watch, but each morning she found herself listening, to the tide, to the soft hum of clocks, to the silence that had finally stopped hurting. The town had begun to shift into spring. Fishermen painted their boats anew, children ran barefoot near the docks, and the smell of salt and blossoms mingled in the air. Life moved on as it always did. Forward, steady like time itself. Evelyn sat at her writing desk, the Rolex gleaming faintly in the morning light. It ticked softly beside a letter she had just sealed, addressed to the maritime foundation Harold had always dreamed of creating. She'd reopened his account, restored the stolen funds, and doubled the donation under his name. The Harold Hart Scholarship for Young Mariners. As she folded the document into an envelope, her eyes lingered on the gold watch. "He always said time's what you give, not what you keep," she murmured. Car door slammed outside. Voices followed, familiar ones. Through the window, she saw Lila and Peter walking up the path. The sea wind tossed Lila's hair, but there was no sparkle left in her eyes. They looked smaller somehow. 2 people finally meeting the weight of their choices. Evelyn opened the door before they could knock. "Aunt Eve," Lila began, voice trembling. "Please, we didn't mean, we just thought." Evelyn held up a hand. "Come in." They stepped inside, eyes darting around the small cottage that smelled faintly of lemon and sea. On the mantel, the wedding photo caught the light. Harold's smile unchanging, eternal. "I know why you're here," Evelyn said softly. "You've realized the landlord you despise is me." Peter's face paled. "You can't, that's cruel." "Cruel," she echoed, her tone still calm. "You forged my name. You sold what wasn't yours. You took from a man who gave you kindness. If justice feels cruel, perhaps it's because you've never met it before." Lila's voice cracked. "We were desperate. Peter lost his job and..." Evelyn turned toward the window. "I understand desperation. But I don't understand betrayal disguised as love." Silence pressed against the walls. Outside, gulls cried over the harbor. Evelyn faced them again, her voice gentle but final. "You have 1 month. After that, I'll expect the property vacated. Perhaps you'll use the time better than you used my trust." Tears filled Lila's eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Evelyn nodded. "Then learn from it. Regret is wasted unless it rebuilds something." They left without another word. When the door closed, the cottage seemed lighter. Evelyn stood still, feeling the space Harold once filled, not as emptiness now, but as presence. She returned to her desk, signed the final letter for the scholarship, and sealed it with care. The Rolex ticked softly beside her hand, its sound steady, alive. Later that evening, she walked down to the shore. The sun was sinking low, turning the sea to fire. She removed her shoes, let the cold water touch her feet, and watched the horizon burn itself into gold. In the hush between waves, she heard Harold's voice, not as memory, but as something deeper, the echo of every shared hour. "You'd be proud, love," she whispered. "I spent our time well." The wind caught her hair, lifting it like a benediction. She smiled, truly smiled, as the tide drew in and kissed the shore. The watch ticked once, twice. Promise kept. Inside her cottage, The photo on the mantel caught the last ray of sunlight. This time warmth did reach her eyes. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to comment below. You never know whose story might be told next.